So tonight we're going to be using a hybrid format. That means that we have attendees viewing both in person and online. If you're watching from home, just know that we're using the webinar format, and that means that you can see and hear us, but we cannot see and hear you. Oh, moving over? Great. Okay. So that's a good note for you, Joyce. We've got to move over. We'll have a question and answer segment at the end of the presentation. So if you're watching on Zoom, you can submit your questions at any time by entering them in on the Q&A feature. You can find this on your Zoom toolbar by clicking on the button that looks like two speech bubbles. If you don't see this button, usually because the screen is a little too narrow, just click on more or the button with the three dots and it should bring up those options. For those of you in person with us, please also hold your questions until the end. On Zoom, we've enabled the live transcript option. If you want to disable the words at the bottom of your screen, just click on the closed captioning button. If you don't see the button with CC, similar to before, click on more or the button with the three dots and then pick hide subtitles. Here in the library, we do have an assisted listening system. If you would like to borrow one of these devices, just ask the staff member at the back of the room to turn it on. Just press the big power button and then you can adjust the volume using the up and down arrows. In the large meeting room, we always have also the Listen Everywhere app where you can access from your phone and then use with your own headphones or hearing aid. Flyers with information about it are also in the back of the room. This is a good time also to silence your cell phones and other devices. And if you have to leave the room at any point, just do so please without disturbing your neighbors, and then just try to make sure that the door closes behind you. We'll close the door in just a second here. Bathrooms are located down the hallway near the parking lot entrance on your left side. And let's see. Then just a little bit of programs that we have coming up. So tomorrow, actually, we have Culture Club about the Netherlands and Belgium. So Eugene Flynn is going to recount his 2019 river cruise in the Netherlands and Belgium, and we can all live vicariously through the fun traveling that he did. Some other stuff we've got coming up. So we've got a really interesting one coming up on September 12th. It's called Not Quite, Asian Americans and the Other in the Era of the Pandemic and the Uprising. So it's very topical. It's told by a professional storyteller. It should be a really interesting program. And like I said, very current. We also have coming up on September 21st, a program called What Your Library Can Do for You. This program is great if you've lived in Elmhurst forever, or if you've just moved to Elmhurst. It just gives you an idea of all the cool things that you can get through your library card and through the library here. So I highly recommend it. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. So our speaker is Joyce Mcintosh. She is the Assistant Program Director for the Freedom to Read Foundation, an organization dedicated to First Amendment education, litigation, and advocacy. She has worked at the intersection of intellectual freedom, communication, and the First Amendment for 3 decades. That is almost as long as I've been alive. So she's an expert. Her degrees in journalism from Michigan State University and Library and Information Sciences have led her to work for newspapers, nonprofits, and for the last 2 decades in libraries. Before joining the Freedom to Read Foundation in 2012, Joyce worked over a decade at one of the greatest public libraries in the United States in adult services. That's us. Doing reference, outreach, assistive technology, and programming throughout her time. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Joyce Mcintosh.
Thank you. All right, good evening. It's unusual. I've never done a program where I've had people here and people here. And I love it. I love it that we've all adapted. Thank you so much for letting me speak with you tonight. Jez, thanks for inviting me. American public libraries are so amazing. And I realize I'm preaching to the choir here, but I believe this public library is one of the most wonderful ones in the world. I will never work at a more beautiful public library again, and it makes me sad but happy on a regular basis. So I started working on a school newspaper in 5th grade, and I would say that ever since then, I've been a bit of a First Amendment buff. And my career in journalism, because you're providing access to information for people, was a really natural motion into libraries. Because as librarians and library staff, it's our job to provide access to information for people. So it was a natural movement. And this community hub right here, including all of you, including people wherever they're at in the world tonight that got access because of their Elmhurst Public Library card. We're what keep this institution going. And the First Amendment is tied in so closely with that. It's what keeps our access to information open and available. And it's interesting because when I spoke with Jez about this program, I talk about censorship all day and I work to fight censorship all day, but I've never really talked to people about the First Amendment and what it means for libraries. So I'm happy to do that tonight. It also means I might check my notes a few times to make sure I'm not making stuff up. So we'll work on that. So my plan tonight is to go over what makes a library unique, what's happening currently in the United States with challenges, and the ways and reasons to keep public libraries as robust as they are right now. First thing I want to talk about is a limited public forum. Public libraries are the only limited public forum. That means, so school libraries are not, academic libraries are not. Limited or designated in this instance means that the public forum is created by the government for a particular limited purpose. In the case of libraries, it's a limited public forum for the receipt of information, but not for the exercise of all First Amendment rights. So you can't stand up here and give a speech. You can't stand up here and hand out political pamphlets. You can do that on the sidewalk. You can do that in a park with permission from the, park district. And you can do that in your own private home or a private business. And so according to courts, the First Amendment protects in a limited public forum, which they should just say in public libraries. The First Amendment protects, one, that we can all physically access the library, and two, that we can read and receive information and use resources made generally available to the public in the library. Now, if a library has made their meeting rooms available to the public and their display cases available to the public, then that's included in that access. But it also means you have to make those spaces available to everyone, as long as they're not doing something illegal. So the library has the right to establish reasonable rules governing library use, and that's your library board of trustees. A library's power to regulate patron behavior doesn't just have to be limited to actual disruption or actual illegal behavior. The rules can be tied to safety, use of our resources, and other reasonable concerns directed at fulfilling that mission of access to the library and use. So I'm going to one more sort of technical detail, and then we'll get into more fun things. And I should note, I used to call a similar presentation Privacy to Pornography. That it kept people awake, but different title. So as a limited public forum, any rules or regulations imposed by the library that regulate or restrict access to constitutionally protected speech are subject to evaluation by courts under a strict scrutiny clause. So what that means is a library has to demonstrate, one, that they have a compelling government interest to limit and restrict access. Two, that restriction is narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling interest. And three, there are no less restrictive alternatives. This is a really tough standard to meet. And it attempts to limit, it basically is out there to protect our First Amendment rights to use the library. It's very hard for libraries to prevent that access to information and use. So the best practices for any public library are to have content neutral rules that apply objective standards to our behavior, our safety, and our administrative issues, and they have to be enforced in a non-discriminatory manner. The library truly is the great equalizer. It's computer access for all. It's programming for all. It's access to materials and reference and information and book groups and story times for all without limitations. All right, let's move on here. I want to share a couple definitions to make sure that when I'm talking about something, we all have the same working definition. So intellectual freedom, the right of unrestricted access to information and ideas protected by the First Amendment, and protected speech. Again, in your home, you can say and do whatever you want. At the library, it is limited. And our trustees and our administrators and staff cannot just summarily make up rules. We have to follow our state and federal laws when we run the library and when we provide this access to information. This is just a working definition I use for censorship, efforts to ban, prohibit, remove, label, or restrict library materials. So when I refer to censorship, this is what I'm stating. Now I'm going to share a few of the documents that librarians have to abide by in the same way that you have medical professionals doing no harm, in the same way that an attorney has to follow their organization's guidelines, and they have to follow the rules of the bar. The American Library Association lays out some of these standards for us. The Freedom to Read Statement has been around since 1953. These concepts are not new. They've been around a long time. Now, there is also a Freedom to View Statement. It came about, I think the first time it came up was 1979. In 1989, it was revised, and the American Library Association added it to their values in a statement in 1990. Any guess what happened that caused the need for a Freedom to View statement? VHS. All of a sudden we could rent videos or we could check out videos at our public library. And at that point we got a Freedom to View statement. Okay, the Library Bill of Rights. So libraries are nonpartisan hubs, and our collections have to show it. When I worked here, I purchased both the politics and religion collections. I can tell you that is super fun in an election year. And we are truly nonpartisan. You should walk through those shelves in nonfiction and in fiction and not have a clue what's going on in any of the librarians' personal lives. You know, if you walk through medical, you shouldn't be able to tell if someone has cancer because there's 5,000 cancer books and only one on your topic. We must provide all perspectives. I'm going to point out number 7 here on the Bill of Rights. Privacy and confidentiality in library use. There are federal and state laws protecting our privacy and confidentiality. The circulation staff are trained to never just give someone your information. Your privacy and what you check out and what you read are truly legally protected. The ALA Code of Ethics. The librarians in the back are going to have some questions for me at some point, I'm sure. Because people say, well, librarians must remain neutral. We must be impartial. And the fact is, yes, those services and our collection must reflect all views, and we must remain neutral in what we offer. That does not mean that as people or as an organization, we must not also be anti-racist or work to dismantle systemic differences. And it's part of the way we provide access for everyone, is to maintain those values. This 9th code of ethics was added, I think 3 or 4 years ago. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit now. So we have this background that we have a First Amendment right to have access to information. That means we also have a First Amendment right to share our opinion and to challenge something we see. The way we do that is every library is going to have a collection development policy that determines what we buy and why we buy it. The librarians don't just make up, hey, this is really cool, I want to buy it. We have to buy things that are requested. So if we get X number of holds, we must buy that book. We have to buy collections based on reviews. We must buy current information, sharing all perspectives. And you are protected. You can fill out a reconsideration form. That's part of that policy too. These are those time, place, and manner policies that we can develop. So you have a First Amendment right to say, I don't want this item. And we'll talk more about that. So that is a challenge. And a few years back, some challenges that have occurred while I was here. Somebody wanted to remove all of the Harry Potter books, and someone actually approached the children's desk. This is when Sharon Carpeel was here, and said, I want to know the name of everyone that's checked out Harry Potter, because I need to call them up and let them know they're going to hell. What do you suppose Sharon was able to tell that patron? She was able to tell them, no, it's illegal. Here is the Illinois compiled statute that protects patron privacy. So that used to be the #1 book that was challenged. Again, your privacy is key and it's protected. And we would get challenges to individual titles. Not real often. Quite often, if someone is unhappy, they will approach a staff member and express their displeasure about something, ask about why it's where it's at. And this would happen not that often, right? So people had that ability and did that, but it didn't happen very often. To give you an example of the fact that libraries are nonpartisan and library associations are nonpartisan, librarians will have everything in the collection from the Epoch Times magazine, which seems it's more conservative, books that will discuss conversion therapy. During the election, I can guarantee you that I regularly had both Democrats and Republicans and everyone in the middle concerned that I needed more books. I'm like, I'm buying everything on the list. I'm reading the reviews. So we are nonpartisan, but those were the sorts of challenges that would occur regularly. And they didn't come in very often. Right now, the climate has definitely changed within the last few years in regards to censorship and challenges in the US. So what's going on right now? I'm going to talk for a moment about the importance of choice. And actually, I'm going to go back to our last screen. to discuss this. So I mentioned that we have the right to question books. It is also a library value that parents and guardians have the right to monitor what their child reads. And in our public schools, very often, almost every public school I'm aware of, whether it's in the English class or in the school library or media center, a parent can say, I do not want my child watching or reading these materials. And you can share with the teacher, my child may not have this. You need to give my child something else. In the public library, we tell people, the children's librarians are never going to say, oh, this isn't right for you, because they don't know if this child reads up here, down here, age appropriate, somewhere in the middle, their interest. What they can do is a reader's advisory interview. They can say, what have you liked before? What are you reading at home? What can we find that's a good fit? That is the parent's job. My mother did not let me watch Little House on the Prairie. I don't know why. She was a major censor with a capital C. But she knew that she couldn't control whether my friends got to watch Little House on the Prairie or not. She was aware that that would be censorship. What happens when people try to have books removed or materials removed is you're really saying, I want to remove that choice for everyone. And this works until someone else says, I want to remove something, and all of a sudden you realize you don't have that choice either. So I wanted to note that. So right now things are definitely different. There are groups targeting school and public libraries and boards. There are many disruptions in public comment sessions. The content right now being the most challenged relates to LGBTQ content and relates to race, whether it's the history of race relations, racism, books by people of color. So those are the categories that are being the most challenged. What is also happening is that lists go around on social media and someone will come to a library and say, here's 20 books, here's 40 books, and I'm going to share in a few minutes an instance of here's 400 books that I want removed from the library. Some states are passing legislation limiting content of what can be shared in libraries. And lots of election issue. And then finally, there are criminal complaints targeting library staff, educators, and materials. So someone in Texas or someone in Oklahoma can say, you are not allowed to share anything related to abortion. Well, the answer is a librarian in Oklahoma may not share information about how to get an illegal abortion. They may and are protected to share information about, here's a medical book that talks about this, or here is a resource list, or so in other words, they can share information. They may not aid and abet an illegal abortion. And it's getting really hard for people, librarians and educators, to maintain collections, purchase books. Yes, yeah. Are you able to tuck it away for a few minutes? Okay. All right. Okay, so adverse state legislation, lots of things going on. Trying to regulate databases. Now, in some libraries across the country where they've said we may no longer have this content in schools, they are then saying, well, wait a minute, I have this database. And it's one thing I love about Elmhurst. We have an amazing database budget. you have access to so much information. But now in some places, people are saying, wait, this title appears in this database, so we're going to scrap the database. So access to information is getting challenged quite a bit. This is a statistic, and with the work that I do, I can share with you that 2022 is just already above and beyond this, and we're not in our third quarter here. I'm sorry, we're not in the fourth quarter, and we're already well above this. And what I want to point out, so that you see the number of challenges going up, 377, 156. The number of titles will always be greater. But now people are placing challenges and they're giving these lists of titles. So all of a sudden, the list of titles being challenged is going to be much greater than the number of challenge instances. For example, I don't want this book at Elmhurst Public Library, and here's a list of 20 more. We're going to consider that one case, one instance, if it's the same patron handing it to us. But that's how come that number of books does not equal the number of challenges. And for the most part, it's books, graphic novels, and textbooks. Programming is getting hit. Once again, this number is going to be much greater this year. Displays and exhibits get hit quite often. That's a hard one too. Films, very low, and other. So another thing that takes place that would fall in this other category are First Amendment audits. Social media YouTubers are aware they can come into a government or public place and they can legally film. You can film staff at work, but you cannot film in private areas. So they couldn't go in a staff private area. They couldn't go in restrooms. They could film kids, but you have to have permission if you were to put any images of children online. And so other is probably referring to things like First Amendment audits or actual hate crimes. Those would be in another category. So I gave some examples of what was going on a few years ago. We had Harry Potter. We had people saying, who's checked out this, more invasion of privacy. I want to give two examples of what's going on right now, just to get an understanding of how different it is in this current time. So Bonners Ferry, Idaho, a group of citizens are interested in not having the public library and not having public schools. And it's interesting because most of us, we have the right to challenge something, and we do. We go in and we say, we don't like this one thing. But most of us are not extremists. And when I start talking about censorship, I'm talking about extremists. So this first example, a group came in and they threw down a list of 400 titles they didn't want in the library. Again, still okay. You're saying, I don't want these in the library. There's a process. We have to follow it. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But the library didn't own those 400 titles. They didn't own any of them. Part of a collection development policy is that you have materials for your community. And this library had materials they felt were fine for their community, and it didn't include any of those 400 titles. So that group said, well, what we're really going after is your collection development policy, because you could have those titles. You could buy them someday. And it is to the point where the director has given her resignation. They are attempting to overturn the library board 100%, and they're attempting to take over city council. So if you go home and you Google Bonners Ferry, Idaho, you will find a lot of national press that's taking place right now. People are showing up at library board meetings and school board meetings with their assault rifles in order to threaten people. So it's extremist. It's not, I want to exercise my right to share with you why I'm really disturbed by one book. It's, I am wanting to prevent choice for everyone. Patmos Township in Hudsonville, Michigan. So I'm a Michigander. Southwest Michigan is my most comfortable place in the world. This building right here is one of my favorite places, but Southwest Michigan is where I am at home. I cross that border and I go, despite what I'm about to tell you. Southwest Michigan can be a hub of conservatism sometimes. And in this instance, a group in Patmos Township decided we do not want any LGBTQ content in any books in our library. So the way to handle that would simply be to show the library we mean business and not at our city council meeting, not approve their budget for the year. What they didn't realize, and I don't understand how some of the council members didn't realize this, was that if you don't approve the budget, you don't have a public library. And so they literally voted to not approve the budget and to essentially close the library. The response there and in Bonners Ferry is that a lot of social media attention and media attention and private investors have created a lot of GoFundMe funding. This is problematic because a government entity can't just take money from people. So they're going to have to figure out how to manage this. But the city council got so much pushback because people said, no, we really do want our public library. We just thought this would mean we don't have those books in it. So the city council is saying we are going to have another vote on this. So the library may close temporarily, but not permanently. And chances are between now and then, it's my hope that it will still exist and bounce back. But this is what's happening right now. So I'm a parent too, and my thought is, okay, there are materials in this building that offend every single one of us, me included. And right now at school board meetings and library board meetings, we're hearing a lot of, but it's harmful to minors, or it's pornography, or it's obscenity. So I want to talk a moment about the legality of that. Earlier, I mentioned that the library must adhere to the law because we are a limited public government forum. So, I'm going to answer number 4 before I touch on the first 3. The what can I do? As I mentioned earlier, I can share my opinion. Every library, including Elmhurst, and this may in fact be ours, has a materials reconsideration form. Now, some of the questions on here are, have you read, viewed, or listened to the entire work? And we'll see in a minute why that's so important. If you fill this out, there is a process, and we must legally follow that process or it'll just get pitched. It's our job to give people their First Amendment right and respect patrons and take this process seriously. So in some libraries, the process is you fill this out, it's reviewed by a panel, The director gets the next step. You know, they tell the director, we think this should stay or go or be relocated, and here's why. And then the director may say, no, I think it should stay. The patron often has a right then to go to the library board of trustees and go through a process there. If you fill this out, your process will be followed. But you need to follow the process. And here's why. You can't just say something's obscene and think everyone will say, okay, we'll get rid of it. There's something called the Miller test. This was a decision in Miller versus California in 1973. And books must meet these three criteria. The work must describe a patently offensive way, sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. The next question is, would the average person applying contemporary community standards? Again, I mentioned in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, they didn't have those 400 books. They probably didn't meet their community standards. Would you find the work as a whole to be offensive? That work must be taken as a whole. And number three, as a whole, does it lack literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? Right now, there are often parents or upset patrons showing up at a board meeting, and they will read one sentence that is very offensive and alarming, or they'll show one picture. But that is basically, you can't run to Mayor Levin, you can't run to Mary Beth and say, look at this picture, remove the book. A book must, in order to be considered obscene, it must follow the Miller test. Is it harmful to minors? I can't just say my 8 and 10-year-old sons will be harmed by this. Again, there's a legal standard. Ginsburg versus New York. This one's from, oh wow, this has been around as long as I have. So we must follow the law when we're reconsidering materials and when we're throwing around these terms. Same with pornography. There is a technical definition of pornography. You can't stand up at the board meeting, show one picture and say this is pornography. Chances are very good it's not, unless it's some actual human beings in actual sex acts, like a photo. So I wanted to touch on the fact that all of these terms that are currently being used do have a legal measure, and for items to be removed from our libraries, they must. So if you were all library staff right now, I would have said this 20 times, and I probably would have had you say it out loud. We are here to provide access to information. It's not our job to defend content, because I don't even know all the content in all the books, and I haven't read every graphic novel, and I haven't looked and thoroughly read every political or religious text up there. But what I do have to do is make sure that as Elmhurst residents, you have access to information that you choose. As a limited public forum, we can create these time, place, and manner restrictions. That's our collection development policy. That's this meeting room policy. That's what goes in the display cases. That's patron behavior. And I might note that Jez and Alyssa can't just act differently than you. They're held to those same standards. And an internet use policy, because that's, people always say, well, porn's protected by the First Amendment. Well, we have a time, place, and manner restriction that says while you are in Elmhurst Public Library on our computer upstairs, you are not pulling up porn. So when people say that, it's like, well, read your library policy. Just check that one out. Super quick before Q&A, I want to talk about several organizations that are working to help in this time of challenge. Unite Against Book Bans was started by the American Library Association. It is a group though, and growing regularly. We're over like 60 partners now working together in order to fight challenges. And I love this website, uniteagainstbookbans.org. It is nonpartisan. It shares wonderful statistics. There are toolkits on how to talk about challenges and censorship. There are talking points if you want to go to your Board of Education or to your library trustees. I love this group, and I'm so excited that it exists. And it's not just librarians, publishers, authors, schools. It's a broad range of organizations. I work directly for the Freedom to Read Foundation. The thing that separates me from the American Library Association is the word litigation. The American Library Association also does education and advocacy. We are affiliated with ALA, but we are a separate nonprofit just in order to do litigation. We've been around almost as long as the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom. We've been here for 52 years. So you'll see up there the sorts of briefs that we sign on to or that we become a part of. For example, in Virginia Beach, someone went after bookstores saying that the bookstores shouldn't be allowed to sell genderqueer or A Court of Mist and Fury. This is information about what the judge wrote up. And you'll see that she did not feel that the books were obscene or harmful to minors. Again, she would have been looking for those technical legal definitions. Let me see, and she threw it out. If you try to just go up to the city mayor and say, I want this book thrown out, and he says no, and then you say, well, I'm going to go directly to the police, and it ends up with a judge, it will be thrown out because the library hasn't followed all of the policies. And the books didn't, in this instance, meet criteria. For education, we partner with library science schools to fund courses, give scholarships. We do webinars for library staff, and advocacy, just the sort of thing I'm doing here, talking with people about these topics and some education. The ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom. This office is absolutely the one to call. Or if you want to be anonymous, you don't have to be an ALA member. You don't have to be a librarian. If you're aware of some form of censorship, you can go to our website, ALA at, oh, there we go. Okay. Basically, you can go to ala.org, look up Office for Intellectual Freedom, and there's a form you can fill out saying, at this school board meeting, this parent got up and read from this book, and they're trying to remove it. I was at the post office in Elmhurst. This guy started filming people and getting in their faces and trying to stir up a ruckus. It was a First Amendment audit. What can we do to prevent this? And you can record that. And this is where, that's how we get our numbers. Basically, people record a challenge. We have a large database. We put in the statistics, and that's where the numbers come from. Our numbers are a drop in the bucket. There are so many just moments that go unreported, and that's understandable. It's a lot. So the other thing I should note, there's something called the Merit Humanitarian Fund. So if a librarian feels that their job is threatened either from discrimination in the workplace, or if their job is threatened because they're defending intellectual freedom, they can apply to the Merit Fund and get support, financial support, either for hiring an attorney or, you know, living expenses or medical expenses. So I encourage people to be aware of the Merit Fund, Freedom to Read Foundation, legal support. The other thing I would note is that if you call me and talk to me, everything is confidential. Some librarians are like, no, I want everyone to know this is crazy. Other people are like, don't ever give anyone my name, don't give anyone my location. Everything is confidential that's reported to ALA if you choose for it to be. So those three organizations, Unite Against Book Bans, the Freedom to Read Foundation, and the Office for Intellectual Freedom, all work together to fight challenges. The Freedom to Read Foundation is First Amendment focused. And quite often we have people, you know, who aren't happy with what we do. Oh, does anyone remember last year when there was a cheerleader who was swearing on Twitter and got kicked off her team? The cheerleader case. The Freedom to Read Foundation signed on and went to court with a number of other groups because a young person's First Amendment rights don't disappear when they walk onto school grounds. And so, yeah, she won that case. It was okay for her to swear and say what she said, et cetera, et cetera. Now, is that a great thing? No, we don't all want high schoolers swearing and doing these awful things, right? Is that the computer or my phone? I'm not sure what. Okay, sorry about that. So in the case of the cheerleader, it's like, no, that's not necessarily a popular decision. We don't. And no, is it good sportsmanship? Absolutely not. But it was her First Amendment right. And that's what we were working to protect. So there will be days when everyone is a very big fan of our work. And there will be days when people are like, are you kidding me? But that happens. And then we work with other groups like the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. They're busier than they've ever been in their lives, I guarantee. PEN America, helping authors. They have the most wonderful toolkit of how to handle online crises and social media crises if you're ever being bullied on social media. There are many organizations that we work in conjunction with. Quite often the ACLU, people don't always want a large organization from Chicagoland swooping in to place, you know, somewhere like Bonners Ferry, Idaho. But what we will do is identify and work with a local attorney or provide somebody who can be an expert witness or work with people but remain nameless. So quite often you'll read an article, you won't see ALA, you won't see the Freedom to Read Foundation because we would rather work with local people to accomplish what's important. I think that is what I've got. And now, do you remember your question? And do we have questions from the back?
So just really quick, if you're watching on Zoom, please enter your question in the Q&A box by clicking Q&A on your Zoom menu. For those of you in person, if you have a question, please raise your hand and then I'll bring the microphone to you. We do just require the use of a microphone for accessibility and then so folks can hear you online and on the recording. And we will do our best to answer all questions, but we do have a limited amount of time. So we'll see how many questions we have and if we can get to all of them.
Hopefully some. Everyone's awake, at least in person, everyone's awake.
Yeah, Ken, do you want to start?
Yes. Thanks for your patience too.
I wanted to ask about, because this is tricky everywhere, but especially the example you had up there, I wanted to ask about conversion therapy. So there's publications that are promoting certain things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're factual. And so where's the library stand on that? Because I think in the case of conversion therapy, I think the American Medical Association or some others have, publicly or officially discredited it.
Yep.
So how do you deal with that?
Conversion therapy and the Epoch Times last year ran a number of articles about the fact that vaccinations are dangerous. So some libraries will go ahead and purchase something just based on patron requests. So if you have a patron or a number of patrons that want books that say this is okay, then they will purchase them or interlibrary loan them. Some libraries will put in their collection development policy that if something has been medically or psychologically, scientifically misproven, they will not collect it. For example, Holocaust deniers. Some libraries will not have things in their collection that are not true. But often they will based on patron requests. Now, if there's one patron out of 20,000 here that says, I want this, usually they'll say, let's interlibrary loan that for you because it won't circulate a lot. But if there are 3 or 4 that want this title, they will typically get it. And it is tricky. It's very tricky. Oh, yeah. Hold on, sorry.
Have librarians been threatened the way that poll workers have been threatened, and what is done to protect them?
Librarians have been arrested or threatened with arrest. As noted, like in Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill, teachers have been arrested or threatened with arrest. In Bonners Ferry, the library director has been threatened, but through intimidation, showing up at her house with your AK-47. So two things happen. First of all, people see it coming. One of the easier and more quick things you can do is get a restraining order. So quite often people will get a restraining order before something reaches that point, if they know it's going to happen. And so far, judges have said, no, this doesn't fly, and they've tossed those out. It's still awful and intimidating to have your job and yourself threatened in that way. But it is happening, not all the time, not all over, but it's certainly happened at least a half dozen times this year. Yes. Yeah.
As far as what you were saying about publications and if they're factual or not. And I think that's where it's up to us as individuals to do our research. I mean, once upon a time, you'd have to ask somebody three different people for directions because sometimes somebody had it wrong. And I think that's the beauty of the public library system is that we have wealth. We have access to all of this knowledge that we can access the AMA out of maybe the UN, the United States. And we should be able to access medical information from all over the world now that we're globally interconnected now, which is driving me crazy. But you know what I mean? There's so many different spins on so much stuff and what's going on in our society. And I wanted to ask, my question was, with all this diversity stuff that popped up 3 years ago, was this prior to COVID or during the COVID or right before the COVID?
It started increasing before COVID.
Uh-huh.
During COVID, challenges went down. And of course, anti-masking and anti-vaccine went up. And that's where, if I went back, 2020 saw that drop. So say if we had you know, 50 cases one year, maybe 70 the next. 2020 would have brought us back down to like 50 or 60. But then when masking was not the issue, at that point,
it
book
went back to-
challenges picked up.
And then my next question is, so then all the libraries are part of the like South or the Western Suburban Library System, correct?
Yeah. In Illinois, we
In
have a good
Illinois.
reaching across the Illinois library system called Rails. Yeah.
Okay. So then what if we wanted to access a library, let's say in Florida or in California? Are we able to do that? Do you know? I wonder how we could probably do that.
Yeah, I mean, interlibrary loan.
Well,
if
maybe
you
not
work
check out the
with someone
materials, but just
through-
like see, you know, whatever online material
yeah.
they have, reference material and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So
Yeah, their
I think
catalog
that's,
is universal. The Library of Congress
Mhm.
does the #1 catalog, right? The instance of each book. And when we pull our catalog, we're pulling from the Library of Congress. So the catalog will be the same. You can access with your Elmhurst Public Library card. Is it First Search or OCLC here?
I want to say first search.
You can access First Search. That's the Library of Congress catalog.
I know you alluded to one of the challenge form questions was about, did you read the material?
Yep.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So when I pointed out the Miller test, which is how a judge would scrutinize whether a book should be left in or whether a book is obscene or harmful to minors, it said the content as a whole, the entire book must be taken as a whole. So if you are a person saying, I do not like Little House on the Prairie, and you are basing it on 2 pages when Laura did something horrible to Nellie and it was mean, that challenge will not be taken seriously because you are not looking at the content as a whole. So that's why we ask that question at almost every reconsideration form in the country will likely have that question.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the challenges you've seen facing like high school public, or not public school libraries in high schools. I know you mentioned, quite a lot about like the public libraries in the community, but where do you really see a lot of these issues happening within the high schools and in that?
The entire country. And the reason is now with social media, it's so much more convenient and easy for members of organizations. For example, one of the groups that is challenging quite a bit right now is Moms for Liberty. And they do share a list of books that they do not feel are appropriate for students. There may be different lists for younger kids versus older kids. And so it's quite popular for members of that group to show up at a school district, often a high school district, and start reading from books. I'm in the LaGrange district. So Lyons Township High School and a group of parents showed up at their school board meetings doing it. It's fairly common. So across the country, another thing we're seeing a lot of is FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act requests in school districts. So do you have these books in your classrooms or in your library media center? Where in your school district do you have them? And if a parent goes to a school district, this is another legal comment that I didn't put up on the screen, but a judge will say this book has to be evaluated for the oldest group that it's there for. So if there is a book in our school district here in the middle school and you read the catalog. So Jez and Alyssa, if they got a challenge, would read the catalog and they'd say, well, this is for this age range. It's usually placed here for this reason, and these are the reviews on it. And it's in the proper spot, or maybe it should be moved. But a judge will say, what's the oldest group this is designated for? Because a parent can't say, well, my kindergartner could get hold of To Kill a Mockingbird. So they will consider where it's located, whether a parent brings it to the elementary district or not. They'll say, look, this is in the proper grade, or it's not, and this is where it goes. Did that answer your question?
All right, so we've got a question from Zoom. So the first one is, if the librarian has a personal conflict with a topic, does your foundation recommend policies for adoption by library trustees?
If a librarian brings a challenge,
Let's see. It just says like if a librarian has a personal conflict with a
Oh.
topic. So if I had to interpret, I would guess maybe like if the librarian selecting brings a challenge, I think that's a fair interpretation.
okay. Just a moment. Let me get back to, I'm not sure, I'm not moving here. If I went back to the ALA Code of Ethics, there are a number of statements there that say a librarian's or a staff member's personal views cannot come into play when they are purchasing materials, because they are purchasing materials for everyone. We must leave our personal convictions at home. I guarantee almost half of the political books I bought would not fit my personal perspective. But that is the reality. I must leave that personal conviction at home and purchase what is proper for all people. So you have a choice of what you read. Did that help, or is it more technical than that, Jess?
All right. So we've got a couple more on Zoom. So the first one is, how do these topics pertain to children that are homeschooled and their home library or their home public library?
Oh, okay. Well, if someone's homeschooled, that is their private, that's their private schooling entity. They don't have to go along with any of this because it's private, not a limited public forum. A public library, though, should, if you have a homeschool group, we have them here in Elmhurst, I have them in LaGrange, and they are requesting certain books for their lessons, then we need to buy them because we are purchasing them for community members, tax-paying card holders. So they can do what they want. It's their personal thing. Same with parochial schools. Parochial schools can absolutely do what they want. They can make a decision to have books or not. Now, we would hope that their school librarians would, just like Brian over here at IC, we assume that they're going to adhere to the ALA Code of Ethics, but the school's going to govern some of that content.
All right. And then our other question, I've read that in some places where they could not get books removed, they are just checking them out and never returning them. How can libraries deal with that situation?
It's frustrating, and it really ends up affecting the taxpayers if we have to replace the books. So they're really, I don't know, it's frustrating. So in June, an extremist group, the Archdiocese of Chicago, wrote a note saying this is not part of our church, but a group proceeded to have Hide the Pride Month, and they'd go into any Pride Month exhibits and they'd remove all the books or check out all the books or hide all the books. And once again, you are preventing access, you're preventing choice, you're really cutting off yourself too. It's not good. Did I answer that one?
Just to add on to that, I was going to say, If people do check out items with the intention of keeping them away from others, they do become overdue at some point. We don't charge fines here at Elmhurst, but at a certain point, they do we'll block their card. They can't check things out. And if it goes even farther than that, we can also send things to collections. So it's not that they can just keep things forever. There are repercussions to these. So there's other ways that the library can do that. But if they're checking it out with their library card, they are doing it legally, even if it's, maybe not morally what we would want them to do. But at a certain point, they do become due, and we have other ways to get that back. But at the same time, when they're checking those books out, they're actually driving our stats up, which makes it look like there's more demand for those items, which means we will buy more of those items.
The number one way to improve sales and popularity for a book is to ban it. Think about the book Mouse when it was banned last year. I mean, it hasn't been published for years and years and years. And then it's the number one way to raise those stats.
When the library board is evaluating a book to add to a collection, do they read the book in question?
Yep. You would have to look at the policy and see who reviews it. It might not be the board, it might be a panel of staff. In a school, it might be a librarian, a teacher, and an administrative member, but they do all have to read it. Then they look at reviews. And I should note something. When reviewing organizations like Booklist, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, they're going to be a little more conservative. They don't want authors to have these problems. They're not trying to put books out there that are going to not be well received, et cetera, et cetera. So it's often good when you're reviewing a reconsideration form to include those reviews, because that really gives you a sense of what group that book is designated for and safe for. Yeah.
So back when the Patriot Act was passed, there was a lot in the press, and I'm not an expert, but there was a lot in the press about somehow the ability to see what certain titles that might encourage destruction or terrorism, it could be tracked, who checked it out through the library. There was some, right?
Was it part, do you mean as an investigation within the
No,
Patriot Act or?
No, not in, it was what was in the press was that now they could, under certain circumstances, find out what an individual had checked out. And it was legal.
Yeah, it's possible that it was part
Patriot Act.
of the Patriot Act.
Yes. Do you know if you know more about that situation?
Jez does. We're going to hand this one over.
I would just say that libraries are very dedicated to protecting your right to information and privacy. So we actually do not keep records of what you have checked out, so that even if we were to have someone come in and if the police came in and demanded it, we would not have anything to give them. You can turn on your reading history. You opt into it yourself on the website, but the library does not keep those records so that we cannot share them.
I should note that a former ALA president, Carol Bray Cassiano, ended up making use of the Merit Fund during that time because of defense of intellectual freedom during the time of the Patriot Act and protecting librarians who were attempting to protect privacy. go ahead. We've got another. So one more here.
One quick question from Zoom is just, will
Okay.
the slides from tonight's presentation be made available to attendees? Do you mind if we share the slides
I'm
or?
okay if you share the slides.
Sounds good. All right. So that one's answered. And
Okay.
then let me, who had a question here? Was it you,
over
Ken?
here, and then should we go for one more?
So when you put up there what the courts are looking at in terms of, and this has always been true, but they're really, to me, subjective. Those how it words what's obscene and how it words all of that. And to me, then it just tells you more and more how important that individual judge's views are. Because one judge, in my opinion, the way things are now, one judge could say this and another judge could have an opposite view. And
Local
it's really,
elections
it's
are
just a comment.
critical.
It's just a comment. It's
Yeah, local elections at every level, your park district, your library board, your school board are just critical. And you're correct. They are subjective. Like to community standards. I mean, it says something that at Bonners Ferry, Idaho, they did not have one of the 400 books on that list. But this group still went after the library. But yes, that's a good point.
People now running for school board, running for library board, if they can, are trying to get into those, just like who's getting looking at voting.
Mhm.
Where it could, like that place in Idaho, based on what you said, seems to me that they could take over.
Yeah.
The more easy.
Yeah.
Next week.
Yeah, if they can get elected, they can take over.
So, like, once upon a time, they had something called the Fairness Doctrine, right? And then they got rid of it. And they got rid of it in 1987. And
They
that's where
being,
the powers that be, our government, got rid of
okay,
it. And that was, once upon a time, there was something known as the Fairness Doctrine that required journalists and reporters and licensed media, which I don't know if the library would fall into that umbrella, but all media, publications and whatnot, to present a fair and balanced view of controversial issues. And then once they wiped out the Fairness Doctrine in 87, that's when public TV, all of a sudden, we didn't have public TV so much. We had cable TV that we paid for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, we don't have so many, a balanced view of controversial issues anymore. Everything is one-sided. Does the library somehow fall into, like that pattern of this bias?
it can. It's interesting.
And I thought of that when
because,
you were talking about the
yeah.
judge and then the board, the trustees, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's interesting because like you said, it's important to do research.
Mhm.
A librarian must read reviews to determine what books they add to the collection. They must have a balanced collection. There are certainly people in the country that will say all librarians are too liberal, but there are also people that will say there are librarians who are too conservative. I mentioned the Epoch Times a few times up there because I know of at least one library right now where the director's getting grief from people on the right and left for having that document. People are upset that it's purchased for the collection. People are upset that there aren't more publications like it. So while yes, there can be bias, I am hopeful that people are following that code of ethics and purchasing the full gamut for their patrons.
Right. It's like also too, that was going to be my question. Like, we're like South Suburban Library System over here, right? But like, what if we were in like Southern Illinois? Would that be like a different?
You could still order things through rails. You could still get statewide interlibrary loan.
So, but would we
And
be
they
able to see
must
what
let
they
you do
have
that.
in their database? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
Okay. That's what
Um,
I thought, but then I.
So when I mentioned First Search earlier, if you go through Elmhurst Public Library databases to First Search, and type in your code or whatever you need to access it. That will show you all the titles through the country. You can limit it to Illinois. You can come up with a few test titles and see who has them and where they're located. Yeah, you really, that's where I started out by saying the public library in the United States is amazing. It's the most wonderful institution because we have access to information and ways to get that access to information. So, there you go. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's kind of fun to have an in-person group again. After 2 years, I got used to saying, type your questions into the chat box. So it's nice to hear your questions in person.
All right. Just one clarification, because I think what you were asking earlier might have been more like about accessing databases that other libraries have access to. So in terms of their catalog, you can definitely always just go on that library's website and look at their catalog. But the way that we're charged by database vendors, we're charged based on our population. So like if you wanted to use a database that a Florida public library has access to, you wouldn't necessarily be able to access it because that Florida public library is paying that database people for their population. I'm just making sure that, yeah, but a lot of the times we have the same databases they do, or we have better databases than they do. And a lot of times that database content is, you know, there's a lot of overlap in it as well. Yeah, but you can always look at their catalogs for sure. Yeah, but unfortunately we can't use databases everywhere. And except there's in some cases where it's like less restrictive. Yeah, for sure.
Elmhurst is amazing. This library and what we have here is phenomenal. I miss it regularly because I truly believe I won't work at as beautiful of a library again. So.
Oh, do you mean like hybrid? I feel like we've always had a lot of programs going on, but I think it might be just like the nothing for a while and then so much again all of a sudden. I feel like it seems like an embarrassment of options.
Like all the public libraries have some kind of events.
There's always something going on for sure, especially with like Illinois has a lot of libraries. Like other states tend to have like a county library system and everything centralized, whereas in Illinois, every suburb tends to have its own library. So we have an embarrassment of options here in Elmhurst and like in this suburban area that there are just so many libraries to go to and we're all holding different events. So, yeah.
For Elmhurst residents though.
Yeah, some of it's for Elmhurst residents, some of it's not, but I definitely recommend you come to the program I mentioned at the beginning, the What Your Library Can Do For You, because that's where we go over a lot of those like things you might not realize that your library could do. I just want to thank everyone so much for coming, and thanks Joyce for coming and teaching us all about the First Amendment and intellectual freedom. Thank you so much. Oh, and thank you. And the presentation will be posted to YouTube and shared with people who registered for the program. So if you want to share it with anyone after the fact, or want to watch it again yourself, and it sounds like we'll be able to share the slides as well for folks who just want to look over the slides. So yeah, thanks so much for coming, everybody.